The morning sun rose cold and sharp over the dry plains of Texas, but the warmth never touched Celia's skin. She stood barefoot in the frost-laced garden behind her family's house, gripping the edge of her shawl as her father paced before her, his jaw tight and his eyes hard. "You've brought shame to this house," he hissed. "A barren daughter? What man would want you now?" Celia said nothing. She had no voice left to plead. The doctor's words had barely sunk in before her mother began tearing up her hope like old cloth words like failure, empty and useless. Carved deeper than any scalpel dot in the West, a woman's worth was too often measured by her ability to give a man sons. Daughters were tolerated if they served some purpose. Celia had none now. She was not rebellious or wild. She had done everything right. But her body, quietly and without warning, had betrayed her dots, so when her father pulled her from the kitchen at dawn, told her to pack nothing, and led her down the narrow road behind the property, she didn't fight. She knew better. Her family believed they were doing what was practical, cutting away the withered branch before it embarrassed the whole tree. They didn't sell her to a brothel. That would have been too overt, too scandalous. No, they traded her to a trader named Silas Boona, traveling merchant who dealt in horses, cloth, and rumor. He was rugged, gray-bearded, and indifferent. When her father offered her in exchange for 2 barrels of flour and a young Mustang, Silas simply squinted and spat. "She quiet?" "She knows her place," her father replied, tossing a sack of beans to the ground by her feet. That was how 22-year-old Celia Carter was sold off, like she was worth no more than a sack of feed. She didn't cry. Not even when her father walked away without a second glance. Not even when the trader tied her wrists, not cruelly, but not gently either, and loaded her into the back of his wagon beside crates of goods and bales of cloth. Ride was long and silent. Silas didn't speak much. He gave her water, bread, and a blanket, but no questions. Maybe he'd seen this before, another unwanted girl with nothing in her eyes but shame and silence. Celia stared out at the changing terrain as the ranches faded into wild stretches of brushland. The world she'd known was behind her. Ahead, nothing but unknown country and the ache in her chest. By the third day, she realized he was heading far beyond the settlements. The people they passed no longer spoke English, and the sky seemed to stretch wider, more endless. Silas stopped talking altogether. Finally, late one afternoon, they rode into a sparse encampment beside a shallow creek. Horses moved quietly between makeshift corrals. Smoke rose from low fires, and shadows moved between animal hide tents, dark eyes watching the wagon as it arrived. Celia's breath caught. Comanche. Her blood turned to ice. Her father had always spoken of the Comanche with fear and contempt, calling them raiders and heathens. She'd never seen one up close, just whispers and glimpses from afar. Now she was being delivered to them like cargo. Silas dismounted and said only, "Stay still." He walked forward and spoke with a tall man, dressed in deerskin and feathers, his face weathered but calm. The man looked past the trader to Celia. His eyes held no cruelty, just scrutiny, as if he were trying to understand what kind of woman would be brought to him like this. After some haggling, Silas nodded. "She's not broken, just discarded." Then he climbed back into his wagon, took his Mustang, and left without another word. Celia stood alone, surrounded by a people she did not know, in a land she did not belong to, with nothing but a threadbare shawl and the knowledge that her family had exchanged her for a horse. The tall Comanche man stepped forward. He said nothing, simply untied her wrists and motioned for her to follow. She didn't resist. She had nothing left to resist for. But somewhere, deep inside, a spark stirred. Not defiance, not yet. Just the faintest breath of something different, and ache that maybe, just maybe, this exile wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Celia stepped lightly through the quiet Comanche encampment, her nerves like frayed wire under her skin. The tall man who had taken her, still unnamed, walked ahead with silent confidence, not once glancing back to see if she followed. Others in the village, mostly women and children, eyed her cautiously. Not with open hostility, at least not yet, but with a kind of guarded curiosity, like she might be a fox caught in the chicken coop. Everything around her smelled like wood smoke, leather, and wild grass. The village was modest, built from hide covered. Tipis, horse corrals, and drying racks for meat. Children peeked from behind their mothers. A few warriors sat sharpening weapons. Celia clutched her shawl tighter, fighting the rising panic in her chest. She didn't belong here. Her father had handed her to a trader like a worn-out saddle, and now she'd been exchanged again, only this time she didn't even know for what. The Comanche warrior finally stopped outside a modest tipi at the edge of the village. He turned to her then, his eyes calm but unreadable. "I am Takoda," he said in slow, accented English. "You no belong to him." Celia blinked, unsure what he meant. He pointed back toward where the trader had vanished into the horizon. "Silas Boone, he trade women. He lie. Say you wild. Not true." Her throat tightened. So Takoda had seen through the lie. Silas must have told him she was a prostitute or runaway, someone discarded by society and not worth protecting. But Takoda, clearly a man of few words, had decided to take her anyway. Her voice broke from days of silence. "I didn't choose this." He studied her for a long time before nodding once. Then he stepped aside, gesturing to the tipi. "Stay, my children need food. I hunt." Without another word, Takoda turned and walked away toward a horse tied nearby. In moments, he was gone, disappearing into the brush with a bow and satchel strapped across his back. Celia stood frozen. His children? Inside the tipi, she found the answer. 5 pairs of eyes stared at her from the shadow's dirty cheeks, tangled hair, and quiet mouths. The youngest, a toddler no older than 2, whimpered and hid behind an older sister's leg. None of them spoke English. But their silence was heavy, expectant. And behind their fear was something deeper, hunger. Celia hesitated only a second before kneeling beside the fire pit. A small pot of broth sat lukewarm on a flat stone. She checked it, weak, mostly water and bone, but still food. She took a wooden ladle and, with awkward hands, poured out portions into clay bowls. One by one, the children crept forward. They didn't thank her, but they ate. She stayed still, letting them get comfortable with her presence. The oldest girl, maybe 10, watched her the most. Celia dared to smile. It wasn't returned, but neither was it rejected. The inside of the tipi was simple but clean. There were buffalo hides layered over the floor, hanging herbs, and a carved wooden figure of a woman with a child. Clearly, this home had once belonged to a woman, a mother. And now that woman was gone. That night, after the children had curled into their blankets and sleep had settled like fog, Celia lay awake near the fire. Her thoughts spiraled. Why had Takoda taken her? Did he think she could replace their mother? Was this another form of servitude, just dressed in softer words? And yet, it didn't feel like prison. There were no ropes, no raised voices, no cold stares like the ones she'd gotten from her own family. Takoda hadn't touched her, hadn't even looked at her like she was property. Just responsibility. Maybe even trust. The next morning, Takoda returned with 2 rabbits and a small deer. He didn't speak much, but the children ran to him with tentative smiles. He greeted each one with a hand on their head, then glanced at Celia. "You feed," he said. She nodded. "Good," he replied. And that was all. In silence, he skinned the deer while she cooked the rabbits with a few scraps of roots and herbs. The children sat together, warmer now, and Celia could feel something subtle shifting. She wasn't the outsider anymore. Not completely. She was the strange woman with soft hands who fed hungry bellies and never raised her voice. That night, as the fire burned low and the children drifted to sleep again, Takoda said quietly, without looking at her, "Their mother, dead 1 year now." Celia's breath caught. "I not want another wife," he continued. "But they need mother. You stay, if you wish. Or go when spring come. Your choice." And just like that, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, someone had given her a choice. Celia didn't answer yet. She wasn't ready. But for the first time, she saw a thread of belonging, and it ran not through blood or name, but through a fire lit in kindness, and children who had begun to look at her not with fear, but hope. Celia had always lived in houses made of timber and stone rigid, lifeless boxes that echoed with her mother's harsh commands and her father's cold silences. But now she lived under a round roof of buffalo hide stitched with sinew, the walls soft to the wind and warm to the sun. This tipi, for all its strangeness, felt more human than anything she had ever known. Still, she was a stranger here, though Takoda had welcomed her in the quiet way only a man deeply grieving could. It was the children who surrounded her each day. 5 small souls, each mourning their mother in their own way, watching Celia with cautious eyes. They spoke in Comanche, words that curled like wind and thunder, beautiful, quick, and unintelligible to her. And she, who had never been good with children, now found herself their only constant presence when Takoda rode out to hunt or tend to the horses. The youngest, Chenoa, was barely walking and cried often. Celia took to carrying her in a shawl across her hip, whispering nonsense and songs from her childhood to calm her. She didn't understand the girl's words, but sorrow was a universal language. They spoke in gestures and glances and soft touches. Older children were a tougher wall to scale. The second youngest, a boy named Nokona, had a temper. On the third day, he threw a carved wooden spoon at her when she tried to feed him. The spoon bounced harmlessly off her arm, but the fire in his eyes was real. He missed his mother, and Celia was the wrong person in the right place. She didn't react. She didn't scold. She simply picked up the spoon, placed it beside him, and left the bowl on the ground. By dusk, it was empty. The eldest daughter, a quiet girl named Wea, kept the others in line. Only about 10, but already with a spine like steel. She didn't speak to Celia directly, but she watched everything. When Celia burned the stew by accident, it was Wea who wordlessly added water to the pot and stirred it until the scent evened out. When Chenoa needed her diaper changed, Wea held the cloths. She didn't help Celia out of affection, at least not yet, but because her siblings depended on stability. Celia respected her for that. Each day brought small, hard-won rhythms. In the morning, she gathered water from the creek in a hide bucket. At noon, she ground dried corn with a stone borrowed from another woman in the village. At night, she told stories in English, her voice soft and low, hoping the cadence might soothe the little ones to sleep, even if they didn't understand a word. She learned a few Comanche words: Naki for 2, Mama for food, Tus for water. The children sometimes laughed at her mispronunciations, but it wasn't cruel. It was the sound of a door creaking open. One night, as the wind howled outside and the tipi fire glowed orange, Celia sat stitching a torn shirt of Takoda's using thread made of horsehair. The children had already gone to bed, bundled close together, forming a little fortress of warmth. Takoda sat across from her, sharpening a flint blade. The crackle of the fire was their only companion until he spoke, his voice deep and slow. "You work hard." Celia looked up. "I don't know what else to do." He nodded. "They sleep easier now. You bring calm." She blinked at the compliment. "They're good children." He studied her. "My wife, died of fever. Last winter. Weah saw. She take care, but she is still child. Celia nodded slowly. She's strong. He grunted in agreement. A beat passed. Then he said something she didn't expect. My people believe grief walks like a wolf. If you feed it too long, it stays. But if you starve it with love, it leaves. The words sank into her like warmth into frozen soil. She hadn't cried since her family cast her out. But now her eyes burned with unshed tears. She blinked them back. I know about wolves, she whispered. Mine just wore a human face. Takoda didn't ask for an explanation. He simply nodded once, then went back to sharpening his blade. That night, for the first time, Weah curled up beside Celia instead of her siblings. She didn't say a word, but she rested her head on Celia's arm. Celia stayed awake a long time, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, because in that small act, something changed. She was no longer the outsider who cooked their meals. She was beginning to become something else. Not yet mother, but maybe belonging. Celia woke before the sun most mornings now. The prairie was still and cold at that hour, the kind of silence that made every sound, every cough, every stirring child feel like a shout. She moved through it gently, like someone learning the rhythm of a new song. Life in Takoda's tipi had settled into something like a pattern, but it was still fragile like smoke held in the hand. And on this particular morning, everything shifted again. It began with a sound of faint, wheezing cough that didn't stop. Celia leaned over the bundle of sleeping children and found Nokona, the boy who once threw a spoon at her, curled into a tight ball. His face was flushed, skin damp with sweat, lips dry and cracked. When she touched his forehead, heat radiated from his skin like a stove left burning too long. Panic swelled in her chest. She'd seen fevers like this before one had taken her younger cousin back home. And out here, without a doctor, without proper medicine, a fever could mean death. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She moved. She gathered cool water from the creek and dampened a cloth. She wiped his brow and spoke gently in English, even though he didn't understand the words. You're going to be all right, she whispered. I won't. Let it take you. Weah stirred awake, her eyes narrowing when she saw Celia bent over her brother. He's sick, Celia said, pointing to Nokona, miming wiping the boy's forehead. Weah frowned and helped fetch more water. Though she didn't say much. She didn't leave Celia's side. Takoda had gone hunting the day before and wasn't due back for another evening. That left her alone with the 5 children and the weight of responsibility pressing down like the Texas heat in July. All day she tended to Nokona, coaxing him to drink spoonfuls of broth, wiping sweat from his chest and neck, humming old lullabies. From her childhood to fill the tipi with something softer than fear, the other children sat quietly, helping when they could. Weah, as usual, stayed close, though her brave face faltered once as she watched her brother shiver uncontrollably. Celia took her hand, and for the first time, Weah didn't pull away. The night was the worst. Nokona's breathing became shallow. His skin turned pale, and he muttered nonsense in Comanche as if speaking to ghosts. Celia wrapped him in furs and held him against her chest, rocking gently, tears sliding down her cheeks without sound. I know, she whispered, though she didn't know if she was speaking to him or herself. I know what it's like to be forgotten. But not you, not here, not now. By dawn, his breathing had steadied. Takoda returned just after sunrise. His arms full of meat, he entered the tipi and immediately sensed the change. His eyes went to Nokona, then to Celia, whose face was pale with exhaustion, her hair damp with sweat from sitting up all night. He almost died, she said in a rasp. But he's better now. Takoda dropped to his knees beside his son. He pressed a hand to the boy's chest, then to his forehead. His shoulders loosened slightly. A quiet breath escaped him. Relief, sorrow, maybe gratitude. Celia stood slowly, her limbs aching. She hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing to the cloths, the cooled water, the pots of weak broth. "I couldn't let him go," she said simply. Takoda looked at her, then not just looked but saw her, for the first time not as a woman forced upon him or a burden, taken in from pity, but as someone who had poured herself into saving what was left of his family. "You strong?" he said. "Like my wife. She fought fever too, until the end." Celia bowed her head. "I'm sorry. You have her spirit," he added quietly, "but not her pain." Celia met his eyes, her voice soft. "I have my own." For a moment, neither spoke. There was no need. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the plains. Life stirred in the camp. But inside Takoda's tipi, something shifted, something unspoken, as if the threads between them had begun to tighten. Weya approached then, carrying a wooden cup of water for her brother. As she passed it to him, Nokona blinked up and whispered a word, "Aina." Celia frowned. "What's that?" Takoda answered, "It means mother." Celia's breath caught. "I'm not," she began, but her voice faltered. Weya stood behind her brother and nodded solemnly. Not in protest, just in truth. Celia looked down at the boy she'd nursed through the night, the girl who had silently come to trust her, the children who now reached for her when afraid. Maybe she wasn't a mother by blood, but she was becoming one, day by day, action by action, love by quiet love. And for the first time since her family had discarded her like waste, she didn't feel barren. She felt full with purpose, with strength, with something dangerously close to hope. Days turned to weeks, and with each passing sunrise, Celia's life grew further away from what it had once been. The girl who had been cast out by her family, deemed worthless for a womb that could not bear life, had quietly become something else. In this land of sky and dust, she belonged to no one, yet found herself becoming everything to 5 children who now clung to her skirts when thunder cracked across the sky. Their laughter had begun to return slowly, like spring melting along winter's snow. And Takoda, he watched her differently now, with eyes no longer guarded, but quietly searching. One crisp morning, Celia stepped out of the tipi to see him carving a wooden figure under the shade of a cottonwood tree. His hands were slow, deliberate. She hesitated before sitting beside him, pulling a shawl tighter around her shoulders. He didn't speak for several minutes, only passed her a piece of jerky, which she accepted wordlessly. Finally, he said, "They do not cry at night anymore." Celia smiled faintly. "They don't need to." He paused, then added, "You did that." She looked down at the ground, unsure how to respond. No one had ever thanked her for existing before. "I don't know what I'm doing most of the time," she confessed. "I just try not to fail them." "You don't fail," he said. "You heal." She swallowed hard at those words. Heal. It felt like too strong a thing to be true, but still, it nestled deep inside her, warming a place long left cold. There was a long silence, and then Takoda laid his knife aside and turned toward her fully. "I want to ask you something," he said carefully. "Not as master, not as man who took you in." She met his eyes. "What is it, my children? They need a mother, not a servant, not a guest." His voice was gentle, but there was iron beneath the softness. "You do this already. I see it. They feel it. But I ask now, would you stay? As their mother? As my wife?" Celia blinked. Her breath caught. Her hands, resting in her lap, curled into her skirt. A proposal, not a command. Not an arrangement made behind her back. A choice. The fire inside her flickered, fueled by something fierce and fragile. She had grown to love these children as fiercely as if they were her own. They had filled the aching, empty place inside. Her that had once screamed she was broken, and Takoda. He was not the kind of man who lavished praise or made grand speeches, but his every action was carved from respect. He gave space. He listened. He trusted her with the most vulnerable parts of his life, his children, his grief, his silence. Still, doubt crept in like a whisper in the dark. "I can't give you more children," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not of my own." Takoda nodded. "I know. That doesn't bother you?" He looked away toward the horizon, where clouds gathered low above the hills. "My first wife gave me 5 souls," he said. "They are enough. I need not more children. I need a woman who loves what is already here." "You do," Celia's eyes stung. No one had ever said it so plainly before that she wasn't broken, just full in a different way. She looked toward the tipi where the children played, their laughter rising into the morning air. And for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like their anchor. She turned back to Takoda and said softly, "Then yes, I will stay. As your wife, as their mother." He didn't smile wide. That wasn't his way. But the light in his eyes softened, and he nodded once, with deep respect, as if sealing a pact. That evening, they sat beside the fire with the children, and Takoda explained in Comanche what Celia had agreed to. The younger ones clapped and ran to hug her, giggling as they wrapped their arms around her legs. Weya didn't say much, but she came over and placed a necklace of small carved bones around Celia's neck. Celia touched it, eyes wide. "What does this mean?" Takoda translated. "Mother Spirit, protector of little hearts." Celia couldn't speak. She simply pulled Weya into a fierce embrace, and this time the girl hugged her back with all her strength. Later that night, long after the fire had died down and the tipi had gone quiet, Celia lay awake beside the children, listening to their breathing. Her eyes traced the moonlight dancing across the hide walls. She hadn't been saved by a man, she had been seen. And, in being seen, not as a body or a burden, but as a mother, as a heart, she had saved herself. Spring came to the plains like a shy promise, wildflowers bursting through the frost-bitten earth, rivers thawing to trickling life, and winds that smelled of green things. The children ran barefoot again, laughing through tall grass, while Celia knelt at the creek, scrubbing clothes clean with a rhythm that had become second nature. Her hands no longer trembled with doubt. Her heart no longer ached for what had been taken from her. She had found home unexpected, raw, and quietly beautiful. But home never truly stays untouched out. It began with a rider-white man, alone, dressed in settler's clothes but bearing no military mark. He appeared at the edge of the Comanche encampment one afternoon, kicking up dust with a wary look on his face and the letter clutched in his hand. Takoda, standing near the horse pens, intercepted him before he could take more than a dozen steps into camp. The two spoke quietly in clipped words. Celia, watching from beside the tipi, could feel the storm coming before a word reached her ears. Later that night, after the children had eaten and gone to bed, Takoda called her aside. They stood by the creek under a pale moon, the grass swaying softly around them. "Man came today," he said. "Said your family sends word." Celia froze. "What kind of word?" Takoda handed her the letter, crumpled and smudged. She unfolded it with shaking hands. Her father's handwriting. Sharp, controlled, deceiving. "Celia, word has reached us that you're alive and living among the savages. While we do not approve of your decisions, there is an opportunity for redemption. Mr. Eustace Granger, a prosperous rancher, has expressed interest in marrying you despite your condition. If you return now, there will be a place for you in proper society again. land, security, and the Granger name. Consider this your only chance. The paper trembled between her fingers. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't concern. It was a deal. Another transaction. I see, she whispered, voice flat. Takoda waited in silence, eyes studying her carefully. You know this man? I've heard of him, she replied. Granger owns half the territory west of Abilene, rich, widowed, no children. He probably just wants someone quiet to sit beside him at church. Takoda said nothing. Celia looked up. They only want me back now because a rich man is willing to look past my barrenness. Suddenly, I have value again. You want to go? He asked, carefully, as though bracing himself. She didn't answer immediately. Her mind buzzed with 1,000 voices. The ones that said she could return to warm beds, silk dresses, society luncheons, the life she once dreamed of. But none of those dreams had ever made her feel safe, or seen, or loved. I don't belong there, she said finally. I never did. Takoda nodded once, then burned the letter. She hesitated, and then knelt by the creek, struck a small flint flame, and watched the parchment curl black in her hands. The ink disappeared first. Then the paper turned to ash, brittle and silent. But it didn't end there. Whispers spread fast on the plains. Settlers nearby began to talk of a white woman living wild. Men passed stories over whiskey, some true, most not. That she'd been kidnapped. That she'd married a Comanche war chief. That she was raising savage children and turned her. Back on Christian decency. One afternoon, while picking herbs outside the camp, Celia spotted 2 men watching from a distant hilltop. They didn't approach, just stared. Their silhouettes were cold reminders of the world she had left behind, a world that still felt entitled to judge her, define her. When she told Takoda, he nodded solemnly. Eyes will always watch what they don't understand. I don't regret staying, she said, touching her shawl. His hand found hers. But they will not stop. Days later, a letter arrived again, this time delivered by an army courier, not a trader. A more official tone. Veiled threats. They spoke of rescuing her from native hands. They called her marriage unlawful. They called her children unfit. Celia tore the letter in half and threw it into the fire before anyone could stop her. I'm not going anywhere, she said, voice steel. They can't drag me back to a place I never chose. Weah stood nearby and asked, They try take. You? Celia looked down at the girl she'd grown to love as her own and knelt beside her. They'll try, maybe, but they won't win. That night, as the children slept and the wind howled across the plains, Celia lay beside them, heart thudding with a mix of fear and certainty. She knew now that love came with cost. That peace must be defended not with guns, but with resolve. That family wasn't earned by blood, but by presence. The outside world had labeled her worthless, but inside this tent, beside this man and these children, she was everything, and she would not let them take that from her. Not now, not ever. Asterisk. Celia had already made her choice. She had stood over the fire and watched her father's letter curl into ash. She had turned her back on the land of porcelain tea sets and stiff smiles, the one that once called her worthless, barren, and shameful. But choices, once made, don't always stay easy. Not when the world sends shadows to test them. It began with a knock on the tippies. Wooden frame, an unusual sound in a place where most simply called from outside or waited respectfully. Takoda rose to meet it. Celia sat beside the fire with Chenoa asleep in her lap, and her stomach dropped the moment she heard a voice she recognized. Celia. She froze. That voice. Polished, steady, slow-spoken like a man who'd never had to hurry for anything in his life. Eustace. Granger. Takoda stood between them like a silent wall. Celia rose slowly, placing Chenoa onto a blanket. As she stepped, Outside, her eyes met the man who'd been part of the last letter. Eustace Granger was tall, broad, and sharply dressed even out here in Comanche country. A fine silver pocket watch hung from his vest. His beard was neatly trimmed, his boots clean. He didn't belong in this dust-covered world, and he clearly knew it. He removed his hat as she approached. "Miss Carter," he said with a nod. "Or should I say, Mrs.?" "Miss is fine," she replied, arms crossed over her chest. "You're far from your ranch, Mr. Granger." He smiled faintly, like she'd said something mildly amusing. "I heard your father passed," he said, tone carefully sympathetic. "Your mother's still living, though she's moved in with relatives back east. I thought it only right I come myself." Letters clearly weren't enough. Celia didn't flinch. "I burned them." He tilted his head. "So I was told, but I don't believe in giving up so easily. You may think you're content here now, but I'm offering you something permanent. Stability, protection, a good name." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that all I am to you? A name to rescue?" He took a slow breath, glancing toward the children peeking from the edge of the tipi. "I'll be honest. My first wife died. No children. My ranch is growing, and I need someone to share it with. I could marry a dozen women, but none would bring the attention you would. A story of grace, redemption, a white woman brought back from the wild. You'd be respected again." Celia's jaw tightened. Every word grated like sand in an open wound. He was offering her a life she'd once dreamed of: safety, wealth, position. And he knew it. "I have that now," she said. "With a savage?" he said quietly. "Raising half-breed children in a tent?" The slap came before she could think. Her hand stung from the impact. Eustace stepped back, shocked, but not apologetic. Celia's eyes burned. "You come here pretending to be generous, but all you're offering is a gilded cage. I wasn't lost. I was left. And out here I was found. I am not a symbol. I am a mother. And I am loved." He steadied himself. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, voice firm. "I regret ever believing that your world had a place for someone like me." Eustace looked past her one last time toward Takoda, who stood silently, watching like a hawk. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The camp was quiet that night. The children sensed the tension but didn't ask. Weah sat beside Celia and handed her a simple clay bowl. Celia took it and ate slowly, grateful for the normalcy. Even as her thoughts raced Dot, she couldn't deny the truth. Eustace had tempted her. Not his presence, or even his name, but the life he represented. A life where no one stared at her in suspicion. A life where she could walk into town and buy fabric without whispers. A life where she could forget, even for a moment, the sting of being other. But that wasn't real. That life required erasing this one, the one that had healed her, taught her what family meant. Here, every bruise she had carried had faded not from time, but from touch. From little fingers curled into her palm. From Takoda's quiet strength beside her every morning. From the firelight dancing on the tipi walls while she mended torn shirts and taught Chenoa to say her first words. Later that evening, Takoda sat beside her at the fire. "You could have left," he said. "Why didn't you?" Celia didn't hesitate. "Because no one ever wanted me before," she said. "Not the part that couldn't give sons. Not the part that cried quietly in the corner. But your children, you wanted what I could give. Love, care, a home." Takoda nodded once. "You are Ina now. To them, to me." She leaned her head on his shoulder. The world might call it Wild Dot, but in the hush of the fire, with a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than what she already was, Celia had everything. The days after Eustace Granger's visit were uneasy. Celia had made her choice clear to Takoda, to the children, and most importantly, to herself. But choices come with consequences, and hers was no exception. The wind carried whispers through the Comanche village, some from nearby settlers, others from within the camp. She was white. She didn't belong. Some elders had always viewed her presence with suspicion, but they respected Takoda's quiet authority and the fact that his children had softened since her arrival. Still, after Granger's attempt to rescue her, that respect began to crack. One of the older women, Navakwa, a medicine woman who had once tended to Takoda's late wife, began making her concerns more vocal. "She has no blood here," Navakwa muttered during a gathering. "No roots. When the wind changes, she will leave." Celia heard it, knew it wasn't spoken in cruelty, but in fear. Still, the sting of it cut deeper than she'd expected. It wasn't enough to love the children. Not here. She had to prove she wouldn't run when things got hard. That she wasn't simply a settler girl playing house in a world she didn't understand. A week later, the test came unplanned, harsh, and merciless. Takoda had ridden out with several men to track a small herd of wild horses, hoping to capture a few for trade. He kissed Celia on the forehead before he left, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than usual. "I'll be back before moonrise," he promised. But by nightfall, he hadn't returned, and by morning, 2 men came riding back. There, faces grim. Raiders. A band of rustlers, white and Mexican men known to strike Comanche camps in retaliation for old battles, had ambushed the party. Takoda had fought, killed 2 men, and taken a wound to his shoulder before disappearing into the hills with one of the stolen horses. He hadn't been seen since. Celia didn't cry. Not yet. The children were already weeping, and she had no time for fear. She turned to the 2 warriors. "Take me to where you last saw him." They looked uncertain. "He's my husband," she said. "He's the father of my children. I'm going." And she did. They rode for miles through uneven terrain, past thorny scrub and patches of scorched grass. When they reached the site of the ambush, Celia dismounted and moved with purpose. Blood marked the trail. Not much, but enough. She followed it like a woman possessed through brush and bramble, until she found a ravine shaded by mesquite trees. There he was. Takoda lay crumpled near the edge, one hand clutching his shoulder, face pale with pain but alive. "Celia," he murmured, voice hoarse. She dropped to her knees beside him, checking the wound. The gash was deep, but not fatal. She tore her shawl into strips, packed the bleeding, and fashioned a sling. The warriors stood nearby, stunned by her speed and calm. "He's burning up," she said. "We need water and herbs now." That night, she sat at his side in a makeshift shelter they built from brush and hides. She spooned him broth she had carried in a leather pouch. She cooled his forehead and spoke to him in whispers. "You came for me," he rasped once. She nodded. "Because you do the same," he smiled faintly. "They see now." When they returned to camp 2 days later, Celia riding with Takoda slumped behind her. The village fell silent. She helped him down herself, guiding him into the tipi, barking soft orders in Comanche: water, blanket, leave space. Navakwa arrived not long after, her expression unreadable. She examined Takoda's wound, then turned to Celia. "You learn fast." Celia nodded. "I had to." The older woman studied her closely. "You love these people?" "With everything I have." "Even though you cannot give birth?" "I've already given life," Celia said, eyes flashing. "In every meal, every story, every night I've sat by their beds. Blood doesn't make you a mother, love does." Navakwa stared a moment longer, then gave a single nod and left. It was enough. That night, the village gathered for a small fire ceremony, a quiet celebration of survival. Takoda, wrapped in blankets, leaned on Celia's shoulder. The children danced and laughed under the stars. The elders passed bowls of stew. And slowly Celia began to feel the weight of watching eyes shift not from suspicion, but from acceptance. Weah approached with Chenoa on her hip. She offered Celia a small woven cloth with intricate beadwork. "What's this?" Celia asked. Softly, Weah smiled. "For you, you stayed." Celia felt her throat tighten. She took the cloth gently, running her fingers over the tiny glass beads. "Yes," she whispered, "I stayed." And finally, she knew she wasn't just tolerated. She had proven herself. She wasn't a guest. She was family. The days following Takoda's return from the ambush passed slowly healing days, quiet days. The kind where time seemed to hold its breath and let the stillness speak. Takoda remained confined to the tipi, his shoulder still bandaged and sore. Celia tended to him like she'd been doing it for years. She was no longer tentative, no longer unsure. She moved with certainty now, like a woman who had finally accepted her place in the world. But outside, the winds were shifting again. That spring had brought more than warmth and wildflowers. It had also brought change. The Comanche tribe had long lived in the balance between the old ways and the encroaching world of settlers, soldiers, and trade posts. But with every passing moon, that balance grew thinner. One morning, while Celia was gathering roots with Weah, a scout rode into the camp with news. A group of settlers, led by none other than Eustace Granger, was pushing to have the Comanche relocated off the nearby hunting land. He'd filed petitions, contacted army officers, and stoked fear with wild stories of his stolen bride and children raised in captivity. Celia's heart thudded at the mention of her name in the same breath as Eustace's. "They'll come," the scout warned. "If not to remove us by law, then by gun." The council met that night. Celia didn't speak at first. She stood at the edge of the fire circle, holding Chenoa in her arms, watching Takoda speak with calm defiance despite the stiffness in his shoulder. Others argued, some advocating for retreat, others calling for resistance. Then Navakwa, the old medicine woman who had once doubted Celia, turned and addressed her directly. "What say you, white mother?" Celia blinked. All eyes turned toward her. "I say we don't run," she answered, her voice steady. "Granger isn't here because of what you've done. He's here because of me. He's using my past to poison your future." She looked around at the circle, meeting every gaze. "But I am not his, not by name, not by law, and not by choice. I belong here." One of the warriors stepped forward. "Then we must prepare. If they come, we stand together." A ripple of agreement passed through the council. Over the next several days, the village made quiet preparations. They didn't seek war, but they would not be caught unaware. Weapons were checked. Horses kept close. Food stores sealed tight. Celia worked alongside everyone, drying meat, sharpening knives, helping repair breaches in the tipi walls. She had no illusion that she was a warrior, but she had become something else. An anchor. The children clung to her more than usual, sensing the tension. Weah tried to be strong, but Celia caught her crying once by the fire, tears silent as she braided Chenoa's hair. "They won't take me," Celia whispered to her that night. "They can't take what's already been chosen." And still, in her heart, a fear coiled like a snake. What if they came with paper instead of bullets? What if law, not war, tried to steal her away? 2 days later, that fear became flesh. A cavalry officer rode into camp under a white flag, flanked by 2 soldiers and none other than Eustace Granger himself, sitting tall on a fine black horse. Smug as ever, they demanded to speak with Celia. She met them outside the tipi, Takoda by her side, one hand resting protectively on her lower back. "You are being summoned," the officer said, reading from a paper. Mr. Granger claims you were unlawfully taken. He is requesting your return under federal law for reassignment to family custody." Celia laughed, the sound bitter and bright. "I am not a child. I am not lost property." "You're a white woman living among savages," Granger interrupted, voice oily. "That makes you a liability." "No," she said, her voice sharp as flint. "It makes me free, something you never understood." The officer looked uncertain. "If you don't come willingly, Miss Carter, this could escalate." "I'm not Miss Carter," she replied. "I am Ina. I am wife to Takoda, mother to 5, and I will not go." Granger scowled. "Then you force our hand." Takoda stepped forward. "You take her, you make war." Tension crackled like a dry branch in the fire. For a moment, no one moved. Then Celia did something no one expected. She stepped forward, drew a knife from her belt, and cut her palm a thin line of red welling fast. Without flinching, she extended her hand to Takoda, who understood at once. He drew his own blade and mirrored her action. They pressed their hands together. Blood mixed. She turned back to the soldiers. "This is my choice. This is my land. This is my family. You can take your paper and leave." The officer hesitated. Granger opened his mouth to protest, but was silenced by the glare of every Comanche warrior standing just beyond the firelight. Left not with a battle, but with defeat. That night, Takoda and Celia sat by the fire with the children asleep beside them. "You were never worthless," he told her. "But now the world sees what I already knew." She looked at their joined hands, both still marked with healing cuts, and whispered, "It took blood to prove what love already knew." And in that moment, she was no longer a woman who had been discarded. She was a woman chosen, not by men in suits, but by the ones who mattered most. Months passed since the confrontation with Eustace Granger and the soldiers. The land had changed again. Summer's golden haze gave way to amber leaves and cool mornings. The prairie rolled on, endless and wide, just as it always had, but for Celia, everything was different now. She woke each day with a sense of purpose, no longer carrying the old weight of needing to be worthy. That word, once thrown at her like a stone, no longer had any power, because in this new life she had become something no one could label. She had become herself. Takoda's wound had long since healed, though the scar on his shoulder remained. He wore it without shame, just as Celia now wore her own, a quiet confidence that showed in the way she moved through the village, how the other women greeted her without hesitation, how the children of other Tipis now came to her for help with splinters, hunger, or comfort. She had, at last, been woven into the fabric of the tribe, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. Still, the past had a way of returning, even when buried deep. One autumn morning, while Celia helped prepare a stew with Wea, a young scout rode into camp again, this time not with warnings, but with something much stranger. "A preacher," he said, "and 2 men dressed clean. Looking for you." Celia stiffened, her ladle pausing mid-stir. "Do they have weapons?" Takoda asked calmly. "No," the scout replied, "just Bibles." Celia walked to meet them, this time with Takoda and 3 warriors at her side. She recognized the man in the middle, a preacher from her old town, Reverend Hastings. A thin man with pale hands and the ever-present look of someone swallowing sour milk. "Miss Carter," he greeted, though his voice carried no joy. "It's not Miss Carter," Celia replied coolly. He looked at Takoda, clearly uneasy. "We've come on behalf of the local church council. Your situation has stirred great concern. You were baptized, raised under the Lord, and now we find you here among heathens, shunning your people, your God, and your name." Celia didn't flinch. "You didn't come for me when I was cast out. You didn't come when my family sold me off. You only come now that I've made a life you don't approve of. Because it's wrong, he insisted. You live as a wife to a man not of your race. You raise children not of your blood. You have forsaken your place. Celia laughed soft but sharp. My place? Reverend, I have fed 5 children with my own 2 hands. I have stayed awake for nights when they were sick. I have fought beside their father to protect our home. What place do you think I should be in instead? He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. I was never a daughter to my family. I was never a wife to your world. But here, I am mother. I am wife. I am Ina. The preacher glanced at Takoda, searching for an ally in reason. Takoda met his eyes. Your God may not see her, but our spirits do. Reverend Hastings hesitated, visibly shaken. Then he did something surprising. He removed a small notebook from his coat pocket and held it out to her. What's this? She asked. Your name, he said reluctantly, removed from the church registry. You're no longer listed among our baptized daughters. You're erased. Celia took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her belt. Good, she said. Now I can choose my name myself. And with that, she turned and walked away. That evening, as stars blanketed the plains, the tribe gathered for a naming ceremony, an idea sparked by Navakwa, supported by Takoda, and embraced by the children. You came to us with no place, Navakwa said before the fire. You stayed, you loved, you bled for us. Now you will carry a name of your own, not the one the white world gave you, but the one we know is true. Celia stood before them, the children clustered at her feet. Weya held her hand. Takoda stood proud beside her. Navakwa placed a hand on Celia's head and spoke in Comanche. Ketaway. The word rang out clearly. The others repeated it in unison. Celia blinked back tears. What does it mean? Takoda smiled gently. She who stands and does not leave. The children erupted in cheers. Celia looked to them, her voice thick with emotion. Then I will carry it proudly. And she did that as the ceremony faded into music and stories. Celia sat beneath the stars, Weya asleep in her lap, Takoda beside her with his arm around her waist. Once she had been discarded, labeled barren, declared unworthy. Now she was wife, mother, healer, protector, and more. She was Ketaway. She belonged not because she had blood ties, but because she had chosen to love with her whole heart. And they had chosen her in return. The wind passed softly through the grass, whispering her new name across the prairie dot, and for the first time in her life, she was not running from who she was. She was running toward it.